Hello and welcome back. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. In the latest G7 development, US President Donald Trump has met with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba on the sidelines of the summit. G7 leaders are trying to find common ground on the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. But tensions flared early after US President Donald Trump criticised the group's past decision to remove Russia. Standing alongside Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, Trump said the G8 made a mistake when it kicked out Russia in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea. He argued that if Russia had stayed in the group, President Putin might not have invaded Ukraine in 2022. Trump said Putin communicates only with him and not with anyone else, and that the Russian president remains upset about Russia's removal from the group, a feeling Trump says he understands. Well, joining us to discuss this ongoing summit is Megha Sharma, our senior executive editor at NewsX World. She's joining us from Banff in Alberta, close to where this summit is taking place in Canada. Megha, thank you ever so much for joining us once again. Let's look at these meetings that are taking place. Another bilateral talk has happened recently between Donald Trump and Shigeru Ishiba. We've had confirmation that Keir Starmer has met with Emmanuel Macron as well, the leader of the UK and France. Earlier meetings taking place as well, including Donald Trump and Mark Carney, the two border nations. What updates do you have for us?
Right, there are a flurry of activities taking place, and yes, bilaterals also are on the agenda, as we can see many of them right now in continuation. Of course, the Canadian Prime Minister is going to be holding bilaterals with all the leaders of the G7 as well as the invitee nations, the 6 of them that are coming. They're already in the process of coming. Some of them have arrived. The others are going to be arriving later in the evening today. I'm going to focus on the agenda that has been set by the Canadian Prime Minister to hold the G7 Leaders Summit. He's spoken particularly about peace and security. He has sought support from the G7 nations to fight transnational crime and foreign interference. He's also spoken at length about the need for the supply chains to be augmented when it comes to critical minerals. And finally, he also spoke about how there needs to be facilitation of private investment, and all this can happen by way of the G7 nations cooperating with each other. This is what he also spoke at the working session of the G7 leaders that happened a few hours ago. And with regards to the bilaterals that US President Donald Trump is holding, the latest one that has just gotten over with his Japanese counterpart Ishiba is the number one thing he already said when that bilateral was happening with the Canadian Prime Minister. He said that the focus is going to be about tariffs, the focus is going to be about trade, and that's exactly what his agenda is, and that's exactly what must have been the talks between Japan and United States, because there have been heavy tariffs that have been levied on Japan as well in the past few months. Again, a halt of sorts that is in place, but deal needs to be negotiated before July when the deadline ends. Japan, of course, is a manufacturer of automobiles, its steel industry, and talking about semiconductors. So what the Japanese head of state would ideally desire is waiving off of the tariffs that have been levied by the Trump administration on Japan, which will help in further improving forex for Japan, further ensuring more exports to United States of America, and of course this all boils down to the one message that went out from Carney, that there is a need for cooperation amongst G7 nations, and by cooperation was hinting at US President Donald Trump signing on those deals and coming to the negotiating table to strike deals and agreements that are going to be mutually beneficial to all the G7 nations.
Yes, Mega, and those bilateral talks and discussions taking place with the leaders of the group of 7 nations, but there are several other countries who will be represented with their leaders across the coming hours and days. What more can you tell us about who will be attending and what the significance of that is?
Okay, so we understand that the NATO chief Mark Rutte is going to be arriving later in the evening. We also understand that the World Bank President Ajay Banga will also be arriving later in the evening. The Mexican President Sheinbaum is also scheduled to arrive, and then Prime Minister Narendra Modi will also arrive at around 7 p.m. local time. Meanwhile, there are not going to be any more bilaterals, at least not from the Canadian side. There could be, there could be more bilaterals that Donald Trump may hold with the other leaders, heads of states who have arrived. A number of press conferences have been planned. They have been scheduled for the next day, which is the 3rd day of the G7 summit, and also the closing day of the G7 leaders summit. There are going to be press conferences that are going to be held by Donald Trump, by Emmanuel Macron, the French president, by the German Chancellor Frederick Merz, as well as the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. So it is going to be important to make note of what these leaders are going to say after the conclusion of their bilaterals and the working session of the G7 leaders. Again, a question mark on whether Trump is going to sign the joint G7 statement on Iran and the emerging situation from there, whether he will be persuaded by the other G7 nations to sign that agreement remains to be seen. Also we are yet to get any intimation on when is the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is going to be arriving. I think most likely he should be arriving sometime later today, and he of course is steadfast on its agenda of getting an opportunity to meet President Trump and putting his case across to him on ensuring that on persuading Trump that US must impose more sanctions and there should be freezing of assets of the Russian government, the Russian industry, and also about putting price caps on energy resources belonging to Russia, especially the Russian oil. So those are all important aspects that we will be keeping an eye on, and those press conferences will give us quite the insight into what has happened at the G7 working session today, as well as the bilaterals that these leaders are going to hold later on tomorrow.
Yes, and Mega, before we let you go, of course, something that is continuing to escalate is that conflict between Israel and Iran. Further updates coming through of strikes from both sides. How significant is this regional tension in the Middle East to the G7 summit? What has been said already, and what can we expect to be said on that matter?
Well, it is significant, and the G7 nations, at least the 6 out of the 7, are wanting to discuss this and deliberate upon this, and that's even they've already built a draft statement, the joint draft statement. The signatures of the G7 leaders will then put a stamp on what they intend to do and communicate to the world, and particularly to Iran and Israel, and also the United Nations and the IAEA with regards to how they want to get themselves involved in tackling the issue. But I think that their involvement in the Israel and Iran conflict is going to remain limited, because as the Iranian president said, that all that Trump needs to do is get on a phone call and instruct Netanyahu to stop the attacks, and that would lead to a complete ceasefire. So the role of Britain and France, Germany, Italy, Japan is sort of insignificant at this point of time, although these leaders, particularly Japan and Germany, have made strong comments against Iran's use of nuclear arsenal, building its nuclear weapons. And just a few hours ago, there was information pouring in that the British and French and the German heads of states are going to be calling the Iranian president and speak to him over a phone call to pass their message, which is in unanimity, that there needs to be de-escalation, and the world cannot allow, G7 cannot allow Iran to build its nuclear arsenal, and demand Iran to stop its nuclear enrichment activities on its soil. So that's that. But Trump definitely went on and said that he has no desire whatsoever to discuss Iran and Israel conflict at the G7 summit. But then again, I don't know if this is going to change in a few hours' time. Maybe he signs the joint statement of the G7 on Iran, remains to be seen. But as of now, his stance remains really clear. He does not, it seems as if he doesn't really care what the other G7 nations have to say about this. He has been going on his it's sort of a go it alone in its support to Israel, and also a strong, very clear statement that if Iran strikes Israel, the United States is going to come out in defense of Jerusalem.
Megha Sharma, thank you ever so much for joining us. We will hear some more from you